keynote-ն գալիս։ Ես չեմ represent արեք հետո մնացածը բան արեք։ Կարաս գլում, բայց լույսերն ես մոնդատը որ representation ավերևա դիտում, մի րոպե մարտում էլի լույսերը։ Okay. Good morning, everybody. So I'm trying to start conference on time, so we can form a good habit today. So I've met many of you today. My name is Armenia. I'm director of the center. So I won't bore you today with a long and deep and very inspiring speech about why do we need this conference and what's going on in the world. So I thought what I will do, I'll basically walk you through the conference and what are our plans. So first of all, welcome to Dilijan. This is the Dilijan Training and Research Center of the Central Bank of Armenia. This was established in 2013, and this is our main training center, and this is where our price stability function is located, and the interest rate decision meetings are made in this building 8 times a year. So this is the 22nd of the Central Bank Macroeconomic Modeling Workshops, and as you know, the title is Advancing the Frontiers of Monetary Policy, and I think what we'll try to do, and it's meant to be reflected in the title as well, we'll try to show through our panel discussion and presentation and keynotes the long way that monetary policy has come through and the long way it has to go. And the other thing we try to do is, instead of making this a very technical conference, we try to make it a good mixture of technical papers and also panel discussions, keynotes, so we always keep our orientation on policy issues. And you can see it in the titles of the keynote speakers. So the very first keynote we'll have will be by Doug Laxton. You probably all know him, and the title is Advancing the Frontiers of Monetary Policy Making. And he'll basically do what I just said, walk us through the whole process of inflation, how the inflation targeting formed, successes, failures, challenges, and the way forward. So how we advance the frontiers of monetary policy. The second keynote will have Tomáš Holub, who used to be head of monetary policy department in Czech National Bank for a long time, and he's currently board member of Czech National Bank. I asked him if his job is more boring now, and he said no, it's very interesting. So he's very energized and enthusiastic. So, and he will talk about intervention policies that Czech National Bank has done several years ago when inflation was very low and interest rates were at the effective lower bound. So this is also a very good example where you have a country like Czech Republic, which has a very good monetary policy framework, well tested, and this framework allows them to do pretty amazing stuff, I have to say. And I have to, once you hear the presentation, listen to the presentation, I think you'll agree with me. The third presentation is, the keynote is Maurice Obstfeld. So unfortunately, Maurice couldn't come to Armenia this time, but he kindly agreed to deliver a keynote via video conference. And his presentation title, I think, is very, very interesting. He's saying, I think his title, if I quote it, is there still case for flexible exchange rates? So I don't think you can find a title which is more interesting than that right now. And the last one is Asaf Razin, who will be talking about globalization and welfare state, which is basically about the distributional consequences of globalization. So I think you can see that this is a very well-balanced program where you have something for every taste. Now, the Central Bank Macroeconomic Modeling Workshops, I don't know how many of you have been in this workshop before, but it is usually meant to be a platform which gives policymakers and people from academia to talk about the issues and the tools that they have are advancing to solve these issues. I think everybody would agree that issues right now are not getting, number of issues is not getting any smaller in the world for central banks, and unfortunately the expectations from central banks are not getting any smaller as well. So I think there is a lot to talk about, and you can see that in the program we have a very wide range of topics. We have a very policy-oriented topics like the role of unconventional monetary policy, and we have also very technical and interesting topics about data science, the role of data science in forecasting and monetary policy. So here again, we try to make it very wide and to have a menu of options for people. That's why we have two parallel sessions. The first session, which is, excuse me, will be here, and the second session is on the second floor. This is session B. Okay? So basically what we wanted to do, we wanted to have sort of a Disneyland for macroeconomists where you can find anything. So I don't know who is the alternative of Mickey Mouse for macroeconomists, but we tried to do everything to make the choice available for you. Another thing which is interesting about these central bank macro modeling workshops is that it's truly international in spirit. So I counted, first of all, our geography this year spans from Chile to New Zealand. And I counted the number of countries which are represented here. So we have 30 countries represented in this room. So I think this also, it gives me confidence that we'll have a discussion which will be not only advanced country-centric or emerging market-centric, it will be also a good mixture of things. So in that respect also, I think we are safe. So now, Doug is looking at me a very strict way because he is opening the conference with the keynote, and he actually promised to pay me for every minute that I gave him. So that's why I'll basically cut it short, and maybe Doug also can say a couple of words about the conference because he was, this conference was started in 1999 in New Zealand. Actually, Ben Hunt was here 3 years ago when we had this conference, and he's one of the people who has started this conference. So maybe Doug can also tell us about the history of the conference. And without further ado, I give the floor to Doug, and then Doug will also start with the keynote session. Please. And by this, the conference is open.
Good morning. I hope everyone had a restful evening. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the conference as I go through my slides, but I don't seem to have any slides. Can we possibly bring my presentation on? Good. So step number one, I guess, pass that test. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is advancing the frontiers of monetary policy. This is going to be based on a book that we wrote before I left the IMF and retired to Portugal. It's a book that's edited by Tobias, Adrian, and Maurice, Obstfeld, and myself. And it goes through the principles of what we call inflation forecast targeting. I'm going to explain to you what exactly that is. And then it has 4 country applications. Of course, we've done many applications over the years, but this is really a book that summarizes the work that we did at the IMF, helping central banks develop monetary policy frameworks effectively since I left the Bank of Canada in 1993 and went there. So it talks about the experiences of Canada and the Czech Republic, which Thomas is going to talk in detail about tomorrow, as well as some recent members of the club, the United States and India. And then it talks about some low-income applications, as well as possibly what the future has in store for us. Now, I want to explain how this framework fits into economic policy, because this is only sort of one piece of economic policy. 2 years ago, actually, Yulia participated in this project. We wrote a paper that was called Macroeconomic Management When Policy Space is Constrained, a comprehensive, consistent, and coordinated approach to economic policy. So I need to talk about this because there's been a lot of debate about the limits of central banking. And in fact, Larry Summers has said that central bankers should effectively just throw in the towel, that we need to turn to fiscal policy. So I want to comment on some of those remarks. And I think this paper tries to outline a framework that allows us to think about it. So sometimes when policy space is constrained, we need to have a comprehensive and coordinated approach to policy. So a really good example of this is, let's suppose that the global economy is weak, a bunch of central banks are at the effective lower bound, unconventional policies are stretched. In those sorts of circumstances, we need to have a combination of fiscal and monetary. And we show in the paper that if this happens, that if you actually have a fiscal expansion that's directed at high multiplier instruments, and monetary policy welcomes it, in other words, it accommodates the increase in aggregate demand and allows inflation to rise, that you can actually get higher nominal income growth. And that higher nominal income growth is actually the denominator in the debt to GDP ratio. So you can actually, these kinds of policies can actually pay for themselves, in the sense that the debt to GDP ratio could actually go down when both monetary and fiscal work together. So this is, I think, a good example. The other example is structural policies. So for example, the empirical evidence suggests that when you do structural reforms and you have a strong economy, the perception that those structural reforms are going to be more durable increases. And as a result of that, you get this virtuous circle of higher growth and higher nominal income and more stable fiscal policies and so on. The other C in the 3 C's is consistency. And so I think it would actually be it's a little worrisome for people to talk about fiscal expansions without actually having a framework for monetary policy and fiscal policy to ensure financial markets that we're going to stabilize debt in the long run and so on. So I just wanted to make a few of those points before I actually get into the details of monetary policy, so that we can see how it fits into the bigger piece. So FPAS, what is that FPAS? FPAS is a term actually that was created at the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. They started inflation targeting actually in 1989, but they didn't have an analytical framework to actually support inflation targeting. So they went for several years actually without this framework, and then they decided to invest in a framework. They developed this thing called the Forecasting and Policy Analysis System, and then by 1997, they tell the world about it, and they go directly to publishing the path of the policy rate. So they go to the highest levels of transparency in the central banking world and so on. And when they did that, they created this conference. So this conference actually goes back to them telling the world what their forecasting and policy analysis system actually was. And then, of course, there was many countries in the world that actually copied what they did in the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, the Czech Republic being one of the more successful examples. The other path to inflation targeting was like the Czech Republic, where they effectively got thrown off a pegged exchange rate into the world of inflation targeting. And so obviously they didn't know a lot about monetary policy at the beginning of the regime. They invested in developing this forecasting and policy analysis system, and then by 2002, they have it ready. They write this book. It was called the Czech Book, that describes the analytical toolkit and so on. The policymakers then use it for 6 years. They're not publishing the path of the policy rate. What they do is use words to describe the policy assumptions in the forecasts that they're publishing. And then by 2008, the policymakers have become so comfortable using this framework that they decide to go right to the frontiers of monetary policy transparency and publish the path for the interest rate. Canada is a little bit different. It was the second country in the world to adopt inflation targeting, but it was the first country in the world to adopt inflation forecast targeting, in the sense that we had developed the analytical framework well before we actually went public with it. So we had a lot of experience sort of doing it before we actually told people what we were doing. And of course now we have the US, which joined the club in 2012. Why did they join? Well, it was pretty obvious. They were providing massive expansionary policies, and they wanted to make sure that if they were to overshoot, that there was a focal point for long-term inflation expectations and so on. So they announced an explicit 2% objective in 2012. So that's a little bit about the history. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the checklist. Remember, we start off with the checkbook, then we go to the checklist. So this is the check transparency list. And it starts off with a very clear announced numerical long-term objective for inflation. Forecasts are used to communicate policy trade-offs, how the central bank is managing the output inflation trade-off. And then, of course, there's a bunch of documents, communications that are all about transparency and accountability. So monetary policy reports, press conferences, minutes, and so on. But the critical thing is that there's an endogenous interest rate forecast behind all of this analytical apparatus, and they publish a complete macro forecast and description of their forecasting and policy analysis system. So what is inflation forecast targeting? So inflation forecast targeting is when the central bank is using its inflation forecast as an ideal intermediate target that is used to manage the short-run output inflation trade-off. So it's ideal, okay, in the sense that it's based on all available information and knowledge about how the economy works. So I don't want you to think about this as going away and specifying a DSGE model and estimating it with the latest Bayesian techniques and so on. I want you to think about this as the central bank putting together its collective wisdom about how the economy actually works, and then representing this in a core model that they use to coordinate the production of forecasts and risk assessments for the economy and so on. There's a lot of emphasis on uncertainty, or what Olivier Blanchard has coined the phrase avoiding dark corners. So thinking about avoiding things like low inflation traps or deflation, or for some economies that still have it anchored inflation from the upside, trying to reestablish an anchor and make sure that long-term inflation expectations are anchored and so on. In central bank circles, it's sometimes referred to as the prudent risk management approach to policy formulation and communications. And of course, analytical tools and models are central for helping us think about uncertainty and the implications that it has for monetary policy. The ECB is not an inflation targeter. They're not an inflation forecast targeter, but they seem to have opened up the debate about thinking about defining long-term inflation objectives a little bit better. And as I said, this is kind of the starting point on a long road for moving towards inflation forecast targeting. So the way that it's expressed right now, the ECB aims at inflation rates of below but close to 2% over the medium term. And the problem with this is that the sentence actually means different things to different people. For some people, they might interpret it as a cap on inflation, and for others, they might not interpret it that way. So the other thing is that the forecast is not used to explain how the central bank's instruments need to be adjusted to achieve output inflation objectives. And lastly, short-term and long-term interest rates are based on market expectations in their forecast. And this is kind of interesting because when we design analytical frameworks for IFT central banks, we actually design the models so that you can't solve them with exogenous interest rates. And we do that because the very first principle of monetary policy is that the central bank has to be committed to adjust the policy rate sufficiently aggressively, or policy instrument in general, to anchor inflation and inflation expectations. And so if you have a model that can solve under exogenous interest rates, it must be the case that that model does not have that primary insight of monetary policy. Okay, so this is so important that we have to make sure that the principles of monetary policy are actually integrated into the analytical framework that we're actually building to think about monetary policy. So this is just an example. So Mario Draghi has opened up the debate about how to think about these long-term objectives. He did this in a speech in Sintra in July of this year, and he basically just used the word symmetry and said, look, symmetry means basically that there is no cap or 2% cap, and that inflation can deviate on both sides. So the ECB has obviously been having some issues because inflation has been systematically below 2% for years now, and their forecast has never really showed that, you know, that it's actually going to return to 2% or possibly even rise above 2%. So it's good that this debate, I think, is going on, and hopefully after defining the objectives more clearly, they will start down this path of inflation forecast targeting and so on, after I show you, some of the great results set. So it all starts off with a view of the monetary transmission mechanism. So this is going to be a simple one. I don't have financial accelerators and so on, but it sort of shows the key fundamental insights. On the right-hand side, we have the objectives. The objectives are managing the short-run output inflation trade-off and anchoring long-term inflation expectations. On the left-hand side, we have the path of the expected policy rate. If we look back 20, 30 years ago, the left-hand side would have been the policy rate today. The view of central banks was, say as little as possible, let actions speak. Today, the view is, you want to inform financial markets because the entire role of monetary policy is to influence longer-term interest rates and asset prices like the exchange rate. So this is how monetary policy works. And so the more transparent we are, the less uncertainty there is about monetary policy, the more effective the first part of the transmission mechanism should be. Okay, so the problem is that if the policy rate runs into the effective lower bound on interest rates, the central bank has to stand ready to bring other instruments in to fill the policy space that was lost by running into this effective lower bound. So what do we have? We have possibly QE, negative interest rates. In the case of the Czech Republic, we had a FX intervention strategy and fiscal assistance. So what is fiscal assistance? So sometimes fiscal assistance, for example, in 2009 and 2010, was a coordinated monetary fiscal expansion. So the G20 coordinated a fiscal expansion that was approximately 2% in 2009 and another 2% in 2010. But it doesn't have to be a coordinated fiscal expansion. It can also be that the central bank simply just puts out a forecast and then tells people that it would welcome a fiscal expansion. So this is what they're actually doing in Australia right now. So they're writing speeches effectively saying it would be a good time to have a fiscal expansion. We have a very low equilibrium real interest rate, and it would be good that we had some support for the economy to bring inflation back up to the target and so on. And they're also talking about things like making sure that we have a 2% inflation premium in wage agreements and so on. Okay, so by the central bank talking about these issues openly, not through the back door where there's a deal made or anything like that, but just simply using its forecast to show what the potential benefits of a fiscal expansion might be. Sorry, I need a drink. Okay, so so it also could be fiscal assistance and so on. Now what I'm going to do here, do we have this expression in Armenia that a picture is worth 1,000 words? Do you have that in Russia? Well, I have a new one for you today. An equation is worth 1,000 pictures. Okay? So I'm going to show you an equation that I think is really, really useful for helping us to think about the first part of the monetary policy transmission mechanism and why this inflation forecast targeting stuff is so important. But before I do that, I want to talk about how central banks that are inflation forecast targeters communicate with the rest of the world. So what we're going to do is we're going to show you the forecast that was made in the Czech National Bank. I think you might have been the head of the monetary policy department at the time, so you can correct me if I say anything incorrect. Just shout out, please. So this is a forecast that was made in August of 2008. How many of you remember August of 2008? This is like before the Lehman's event on September 15th of 2008. This was not a popular time to be a central banker. Oil prices had reached $150 in July, so commodity price shocks were driving inflation up, and as we can see, the Czech Republic was not immune to that. Inflation was well above the target. So actual inflation was 8%. The monetary policy relevant inflation was about 6%. And the Czech National Bank's, so it's very, very important that I explain this clearly, what these graphs actually are. They are constructed by the Monetary Policy Department at the Czech National Bank. These are not policymakers sitting around a boardroom coming up with these forecasts. So this forecast is generated by the Monetary Policy Department and is presented to the board and is used as a frame of reference to have a rich discussion about monetary policy issues. So you can think about it, let's suppose that you're policymaker A, and you look at this forecast and you say, okay, what's the story in the forecast? Well, there's some temporary factors that are keeping inflation high. A lot of those temporary factors are going to fall out of the year-on-year calculation of inflation. So that's an important assumption that the staff are communicating to the policymakers. And as a result of that, and the fact that the view was that the global economy is going to slow down, okay? The Czech economy, because it's very open, is also going to slow down. And the implication of those assumptions are that there's going to be a tendency for the policy rate to decline over time. So it's very, very important. That's the story that you're actually looking at on the screen right now. So in other words, you don't want to think about this black line right here being the policy. That is not the policy. The policy is a commitment to always adjust that line in response to new information so that you can anchor long-term inflation expectations and so on. So it's so important because when some central banks try to do this, the policymakers think that they have to own that line, and they don't have to own the line. All they need to have is a consistent macro forecast put in front of them so that they can then have a rich discussion about how they see the economy relative to that line. So for example, let's suppose that the policymaker's word is pessimistic as that line. Well, they would then communicate that this is the staff forecast, but it was locked in a couple of weeks ago, and the information is such that we're not quite as pessimistic as what's in this baseline forecast, and as a result of that, we're not cutting interest rates. Now, they might also say, we're actually more pessimistic. The information that's come in over the last 2 weeks is actually worse than it was when they constructed the forecast, and as a result, we think that we need to cut interest rates even more. So this was actually quite a brave forecast, considering that other central banks were raising interest rates at the time. What happened? They cut interest rates. So the Czech National Bank actually cut interest rates before the Lehman's event. So they went with the forecast, and of course, it turned out that was probably the right decision ex post, and probably Thomas is probably going to tell us it was the right decision ex ante as well. Okay, so they did that when other banks like the ECB was actually raising interest rates. So it seems like you seem to do the opposite of other central banks. So let's go back to the equations. Okay, so this is just some more examples. They go along, and then they run into the effective lower bound on interest rates. So they show a forecast where the policy rate actually is below the effective lower bound, which of course is impossible. And they do that basically just to illustrate that the distribution of inflation and output contains bad things in it. It contains deflation, but not just deflation, bad deflation. In other words, it contains the combination of falling prices and falling GDP. So it's okay for prices to fall if GDP was booming, but the combination of prices falling and output falling, those are bad things. And so as a result of that, they then think about another instrument. In this particular case, because the Czech economy was so open, the natural instrument was an FX intervention strategy. They depreciate the currency, but using the framework. So in other words, they tell people that we're actually planning to overshoot. We would like inflation to overshoot the target. And we're going to generate this overshooting with this strategy that depreciates the currency. I won't go into too much detail because Thomas is going to be talking about this tomorrow. Anyway, it turns out, obviously, shocks happen. It took longer to get inflation up, but they were successful. Now inflation is actually above the target. So you can see it's been above for several years now. And now, of course, they're talking about potentially raising interest rates a little bit in the forecast and so on. So anyway, I won't talk too much more about the Czech Republic. So we call that conventional forward guidance. So it's very simple. You just construct a consistent macro forecast, and then you look at it and you just tell a story and explain what's in it. And if you disagree with it, you then tell people how you disagree with it, and that's how you communicate monetary policy. And there's a lot of emphasis on uncertainty. In other words, there's fan charts around basically the point forecasts and so on. So that's conventional forward guidance. This is unconventional forward guidance. This is what the big central banks did during the crisis. They used words to describe what they were doing. So my favorite is the word patient. So the Fed used the word patient when they were talking about raising interest rates. They said, we're going to be patient raising interest rates. And the problem is that when you use that word patient and then you start to talk about raising interest rates, you have to drop the word patient. So in their particular case, they said, just because we remove the word patient doesn't mean we are going to be impatient. So the question, I mean, you can judge for yourself, what's a better way to communicate monetary policy? Now, as I said, the Fed then went on to announce inflation targeting. So this was, a lot of this stuff was sort of before they had developed the framework to do inflation targeting. Another great one that I like is the quote by Jean-Claude Trichet in 2007, again, when commodity prices were high and inflation was high. Strong vigilance is therefore of the essence to ensure that risks to price stability over the medium term do not materialize. So there's a big problem using this word strong vigilance, because what are you going to do next time? Are you just going to go back to ordinary vigilance? Or are you going to just say, no, we're no longer going to be vigilant? So there's a problem just using these words when you don't have a forecast to sort of flesh out the story. So unconventional forward guidance, what's the problems with it? Well, what they were trying to do was effectively talk down long-term interest rates and get credit going again. And what do? You say, well, we're going to keep interest rates low for long. And that does two things. It reduces the expected path of the policy rate. And you're trying to convince people that you really are going to be committed to keeping interest rates low for long, so you're trying to reduce the term premium. So in other words, you're trying to reduce the compensation for interest rate risk in the future so you can really depress those long-term interest rates. Now, what's wrong with this strategy, fundamentally, is that if you're successful, you will get into trouble. Because if you're successful and it does stimulate the economy, there's going to come a day when you're going to have to exit those policies. And on that day, if you don't have the forecast that's been emphasizing uncertainty and everything else, you're going to get these discontinuous jumps in the term premium and in long-term interest rates. So this is an example during the Tabor tantrum, okay, where they just gave a speech. The financial markets, sent shockwaves through the global financial markets. The term premium jumped up and long-term interest rates rose and so on. So there's a risk from unconventional forward guidance that if it's successful and you get long-term interest rates down, you stimulate the economy, you can get these discontinuous jumps in the future as expectations adjust. The other example of unconventional forward guidance was using things like threshold rules. So remember, some of the central banks got into the communication game where they said, as long as unemployment, remains high, we're not going to increase the policy rate. And the problem with this, of course, is, can you really represent everything that I was talking about in that forecast with a simple rule that's basically a function of the unemployment rate? And I think the answer is that when you look at the experiences of the central banks that used these threshold rules, they were not very robust. In the case of the Bank of England, I think it lasted less than a year, and financial markets were asking for more guidance about the forward guidance, okay? So this is just an example of, if you just look at the first row, you can see the types of forward guidance that the Fed used. So it started off as qualitative, and then it went to date-based, and then it went to threshold-based, and then it went back to qualitative. So this is much, much different than the communication strategies of a inflation forecast targeting central bank, where you have this analytical framework and you're simply just replacing one instrument with another instrument to explain how you're adjusting your instruments to move inflation back to the target. So it turns out that, at least according to Dinser-Eichengreen, that the central banks that are the most transparent in the world are the seasoned inflation forecast targeters. So this is just an example of Sweden, the Czech Republic, and New Zealand, okay? The Dinser-Eichengreen index goes up to 15, and so we can see, according to Dinser and Eichengreen, they're perfect. There's no more room for further improvements in transparency in these three central banks. We don't believe that to be true, so I've been doing a lot of work with people actually at the Central Bank of Armenia and New Zealand and the Czech Republic and Chile, where we actually ask, how could we further actually improve transparency and so on? These are just some aspects, some benefits of transparency. I've already tried to convince you that it can improve policy effectiveness, it can increase or simplify central bank communications, okay? But there's other reasons as well. It's actually a requirement of democratic principles and accountability. So you can't have accountability without high levels of transparency. And we think we can build a case that it builds support for central bank independence and overall policies of the central bank. Okay, so this is just an example of a forecast from Consensus Economics in 2016. Remember, that was a period where policymakers sometimes were viewed as being constrained. And we can see that the inflation forecast targeters, i.e. Canada down the list to the United States, professional forecasters were all expecting that inflation was going to return back to the target and in some cases actually even overshoot it by a little bit. Whereas if you look at the euro area and Japan, they're expecting that inflation is going to stay well below it. This is basically just looking at all the observations since 2014. And what we have on the axis going left is a deviation of expected inflation this year relative to the target. So we can see that almost all the observations are to the left. So inflation has been below the target, that's all it's saying. What we would like, in the best of all possible worlds, as I'm going to show you in a second, is that people would expect that there's going to be very stimulatory policies and that they actually expect that inflation is going to actually rise above the target. So we'd actually like to see observations in this quadrant right here, because that, as I'm going to show you, that's a sign of macroeconomic stability. The last thing that we want to see are these two quadrants. So this is the 1970s. So actual inflation drifts up and long-term inflation expectations drift up with it. This is what's going on now. Inflation's actually below the target and long-term inflation expectations are ratcheting down in places like Japan and the Euro area and so on. So this is just actually looking at the data. So it used to be the case in Canada that long-term inflation expectations actually used to move around with short-term inflation expectations, but since 2000, long-term inflation expectations have been very well anchored to the target. This is the Czech Republic, same story, except long-term inflation expectations are now gold. Red is 3-year ahead. So it used to be the case that long-term moved around with short-term, but now long-term is effectively stabilized. This is the opposite. This is Korea. Korea, long-term inflation expectations are still moving around with short-term inflation expectations, but in addition to that, they're just not using their policy space to deal with the problem. And in fact, instead of using their policies very, very aggressively to anchor long-term inflation expectations, they actually changed the target. So when long-term inflation expectations fell from 3 to 2, they actually reduced the target. A lot of central banks nowadays would actually like a 3% inflation target, but because the 2 has been so successful, they're actually, I think, a little bit afraid of actually going from 2 to 3. But so this is an example in the data sets that we're using where long-term inflation expectations are moving around with the target. Okay, back to the equations, okay? That's the equation. No, this isn't the equation. This is just risk-adjusted UIP. The problem, so this basically is just saying that the domestic interest rate, so we have equations like this in our models, okay? Sometimes we back off the pure form of UIP, but we usually have some sort of arbitrage condition in our models. And it's the basic idea behind it is that the domestic interest rate is equal to the expected depreciation in the currency plus the foreign interest rate adjusted for country risk premium. Now this equation can't really tell us very much because we don't know anything about ST+1. I'm going to tell you the story about ST+1 because that turns out to be very, very important. So to tell the story about ST+1, what I'm going to do is basically just lead it. So if the arbitrage holds in today, it should hold next period or next quarter or whatever. And then I'm just going to keep on doing that. And then I'm going to add them up. And so on the left-hand side, what do I have? I've got, that's the expected path of the policy rate on the left-hand side, right? So that's the beginning of my monetary transmission mechanism. Or I could think about it as a long-term bond rate without a term premium, okay? So this is the very first part of the transmission mechanism about how the central bank influences this expected path of the policy rate, which then influences things like long-term interest rates and so on. And we can see that's going to be equal to the expected depreciation over the life of this K-period bond. So I want you to think about it as a bond now. So people in the domestic economy are going to have to be compensated for this exchange rate, expected exchange rate depreciation. So S is going to be an increase. That's going to be a depreciation, okay? And then, of course, we have the bond in the foreign country adjusted for the cumulative sum of the country risk premium and so on. So we can actually use this now to tell a pretty good story about what's been going on in a lot of places in the world. So what happens? Well, in Canada, it's very much like Armenia. They have fixed action dates. And so the policymakers only get together and decide about the policy 8 times a year. And during the other times, in between those 8 times, financial markets are anticipating what the policymakers are going to do to the policy interest rate path in the future. And so they're trying to guess when new information comes in about the economy, what the policymakers are going to do in the future, and that then influences longer term interest rates and asset prices like the exchange rate and so on. So we can also write this thing in real terms, and for some of you maybe that will be more intuitive. So the left-hand side would just be the real rate of return on the K-period bond, the expected real depreciation, and of course on the right-hand side we just have the foreign country risk premium. So what happens? So there's a shock. And it can be any shock that reduces demand by more than supply. I don't like calling it a demand shock. So it could be all kinds of shocks, including a risk haven shock, where funds are actually pouring into your country. That can actually be contractionary because demand can actually fall by more than supply. So I just want you to think, all the DSG guys out there, that it's just some shock that reduces aggregate demand in the goods market by more than aggregate supply. Now what happens? Well, in between these policy meetings, financial markets anticipate that the expected path of the policy rate is going to fall in the future, and that actually results in a depreciation in the currency. So remember, an increase is S. Okay? So S goes up, that's a depreciation. Now the question is, how much does S change by? And the answer is, well, we have to know about ST plus K plus 1. So how much S actually works as a shock absorber in the economy depends on where people think that the exchange rate's going to go over the longer term. Okay, and that depends on your policy framework, on your reaction function for monetary policy. So let's go back to 3 possibilities. Possibility 1, the central bank and maybe fiscal are working very aggressively, telling people that we are going to be doing average inflation targeting. So in other words, the initial shock is driving inflation down, aggregate demand's less than aggregate supply, but we're going to be responding very, very aggressively to the point where we're actually going to make inflation rise above the target by exactly the same amount as it is below the target. And so what does this mean? This means that the price level is going to go back to what it was before. Okay? So I just want you to have that thought in your mind that the price level is going back. I just want you to use it as an analytical benchmark to describe basically what other scenarios might be. Well, what are other scenarios? Other scenarios is that the central bank says, I'm going to gradually return inflation back to the target. And in that case, the price level is going to be lower, right? Because the cumulative distance under the 2% line is negative. Or you can have the really dangerous case where people actually believe that inflation is going to stay lower. So it's not going to go back to 2%. It's going to actually ratchet down to 1.5%. In this case, the price level is going to be a lot lower. Okay? So what we need to do is to then think through what the implications of that are. So now let's think about the real exchange rate. So remember, I defined the exchange rate so that an increase is a depreciation. So I'm going to think of the real exchange rate as equal, think of it in logs. It's going to be equal to the nominal exchange rate plus the foreign price level minus the domestic price level. Okay? And so nominal exchange rate goes up, that's an improvement in competitiveness. S goes up. Foreign prices go up, that's an improvement in competitiveness. If my price level goes down, that's an improvement in competitiveness. If my price level goes up, if my price level goes down, that's an improvement in competitiveness. So as long as the shock doesn't affect the equilibrium real exchange rate, we know that the nominal exchange rate then is going to have to move 1 for 1 with the terminal condition on the price level. So if you have a situation where people expect that the price level is going to be lower in the future, they also have to expect that the exchange rate is going to be more appreciated in the future. And if the exchange rate is going to be more appreciated in the future, the UIP condition says that that is actually going to make the exchange rate appreciate today. So in this case, when you're not adjusting your interest rate aggressively, maybe because you're at the effective lower bound, you can actually get the exchange rate moving with the opposite sign of what it normally does when the central bank's credible and they have policy space and so on. So this is important. This is not an abstract notion that I'm bringing to you today. It actually happens in the real world. Let's look at a contrast between two cases. In the top, we have Canada, which is a very seasoned inflation forecast targeting regime. And in the bottom, we have Japan. And this is right after the global financial crisis. So we're looking at 2009 and 2010. So what happens? In Canada, they go into it with about 400 basis points of policy space. Big shock happens in the US. Obviously, Canada is very linked to the United States, but we did not have a problem with our financial system. We were just facing this big external demand shock, global shock. The shock was so big, and because it had such large global implications, commodity prices halved. Canada is an export. We export commodities. So we faced what is known as in Canada as a double whammy, because we got massively lower commodity prices and a big negative external demand shock. What happened? Long-term interest rates fell. Obviously, they expected that short-term interest rates were going to be lower, and the Canadian dollar depreciated, acting as a shock absorber, exactly as it should happen. In the case of Japan, they went into it with very little interest rate space, and because they did not have alternative tools ready to go, what happens? The exchange rate appreciates by 20%. This results in a contraction in exports that's like twice as large as what had happened in Canada. The higher real interest rates reduces domestic demand, and they end up with an output gap that's twice as large as what it was in Canada. So this is, I think, a good contrast. Now, is this story just about what happened after the global financial crisis? No. This story is true every day, almost every day. So if you actually look at Canada, this is not Canada, this is Japan, on days when there's bad economic information hitting the market, it's natural for financial analysts to write, there was bad economic news hitting the market, therefore the Canadian dollar depreciated and long-term bond yields fell. That's what you will read in the financial press. People will type it out because it's a correlation that's pretty strong in the data. In the case of Japan, what they will write is there was some negative news and the yen appreciated. And they'll write that down like it was almost a rule, because it's a correlation that's really, really strong in the data. So there's actually the wrong correlation between things like the stock market and it's not just in the traded goods sector, it's actually also in the non-traded goods sector. So that's all I have to say about conventional monetary policy today. I believe that there's some lessons that could be learned for thinking about macroprudential policies. So just to summarize, what have I said? I've said that we need to think about policy in terms of instruments and objectives. And this is obviously true for thinking about macroprudential policy. So we need to design models that have vulnerabilities in them, but that also have instruments so that we can think about not only telling people that something bad might be coming in the future, but we could also tell them about something we could change to prevent that bad thing from coming in the future, or at least reducing the severity. So these are examples of models that are based on endogenous money creation, where there's vulnerabilities, there's the potential for crises. They're based on the empirical evidence that the best indicator of a financial crisis is the combination of high credit growth and high property prices. Okay? So the entire model is based on that notion, and it has instruments like things like countercyclical buffers or loan-to-value limits and so on. So now I'm going to get very, very specific. So there's this big issue out there about the HP filter. I wrote a paper in 1993 that basically said don't use the HP filter. It's almost exactly what James Hamilton argued, why you should never use the Hodrick-Prescott filter. And I think I would add, for policy. It's okay to use the HP filter if you're just looking at some data and stuff like that, but you do not want to use the HP filter for policy. Anyway, so James writes his paper and basically says we can do a lot better than the HP filter, so it's bad to use it, but we can do much better. And so these authors actually go away. They had found that the HP filter gaps for the credit to GDP ratio actually worked empirically in terms of predicting financial crises. So they go away and they ask, well, do alternative univariate filters work better than the HP filter for predicting the historical financial crises, the financial crises in the past, I want to emphasize, okay? And they find that the Hodrick-Prescott filter gaps actually win, okay? Now, when we think about doing policy modeling, so I want to go back to talking about the purpose of this conference and so on. It's okay for us to do technical work, but we always have to be very critical, especially if we're thinking about bringing ideas to policy. So we have to be very, very critical. And one way of being critical is to actually think about how things might play out in the future and then ask, what is my technique going to tell me? So this is actually a really good test to go through. And every time you take something to a policymaker, you should be doing it, doing a lot of that kind of thinking. So let's think about the Chinese credit to GDP ratio. So this is what it looks like. So basically it used to be about 100%, and now it's 200%. And because people are concerned in China about 200%, you can see that they've been trying to slow credit down. So the credit to GDP ratio has actually flattened a little bit, okay? Now you can see why an HP filter is going to be giving us positive output gaps, because basically it's just lagging this sharp increase. So this methodology is only going to work when you have a situation where it's kind of flat here, and then it really picks up, and then the HP filter then kind of lags it. And that's how you get this positive output gap. But the problem is that now you can see the credit gap, the credit to GDP ratio gap, is now 0. Do we think the problems in the shadow banking system in China have gone away? Are we not concerned about the fact that property prices in Tier 1 and Tier 2 cities are really, really high? Okay, so we have to be really, really careful. So I want you to go through this thought experiment with me. The policymaker, the advisor walks in, and the policymaker says, how much can my credit to GDP ratio rise over the next few decades without having a positive credit gap? And what's the answer? And so he asked the advisor to basically go away and work it all out and come back with the answer. And the advisor says, no, I can tell you what the answer is now. He says, how can you figure that out right now? He said, well, the HP filter, the statistical assumptions behind it are that the credit gap is white noise and that there's a unit root in the trend credit to GDP ratio. So all I need to know is one number. What was the trend increase in the credit to GDP ratio last quarter? And I can simply just extrapolate that number into the future. So if you like, Mr. Policymaker, you can actually increase the credit to GDP ratio from 200 to 400. So this is an example where, just, updating things mechanically, obviously are incredibly problematic. Okay, so hopefully that convinced you don't use the HP filter. So let's sum up and mechanically update it for policymaking purposes. So I want to sum up. First point, keep working on developing better analytical frameworks for supporting monetary policy. It appears that we haven't completed the task for conventional monetary policy, so we have to complete the task in those central banks that haven't developed these frameworks. Also apply it to fiscal. So we're lucky to have somebody here from Chile. It's actually hard to look around the world and find good fiscal frameworks, but Chile, I think, is an example where actually there has been progress developing fiscal policy frameworks. And of course, we're just starting the process of developing frameworks to think about macroprudential policies and so on. Second point, we should be able to do better than the HP filter for thinking about the credit gap or measuring potential output and so on. And thank you for your attention. I think I'm a bit ahead of schedule.
Okay, thank you very much, Doug, for a presentation. I think we are doing very well on the time. So we have time for questions. So we'll have 10 minutes for questions, and you can see that there are mics in the room. And after that, we can basically split into two sessions, which is here and the second floor. Okay? So the floor is open for questions, please. Please.
Well, first of all, I must say I enjoyed very much your lecture, which is really sort of combines practicalities with some underlying theoretical stuff. Now, having experience myself from both as an academic and as a policymaker, I want to bring out some of the limitations of those frameworks that maybe, I'm sure you are aware of those, but transparency and all that has its limits. And even in those very sophisticated new frameworks and all that, there are some limits that are dictated, I think, by human attention, the ability to transmit information from the central bank, which is very specialized to the general public, rational in attention, and things like that. So let me give you, I don't want to make it too long, but just one example of that. And that is when the central bank publishes an interest rate path, okay, there is always a question whether this interest rate path is a commitment to the interest rate path, or whether this is a forecast that is made by the staff, and that the body that actually makes the decision, which is the Monetary Policy Committee or the FOMC in the United States, or the Council in the European Central Bank and so on, whether they put their stamp on that or not. Now, my experience has been that many times they don't put their stamp on it. But if they do, in the case where they do, there is a catch-22 here. Because you know, the forecasts are not, you know, as your fan chart show, you know, the forecast is just a forecast. Okay, so now, then, you know, there is a forecast, and this interest rate path is conditional on the forecast, and then something else happens. And then they have to change their mind, you know, they have to adjust it. They cannot, you know, so there's a tension between what they have announced ex ante and between what they might do and usually will do ex post, rightly so. But then the question is, you know, how much they do that because of reasons that are justified, like in the case that I, you know, just described, and how much is sort of playing a little bit with credibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much for raising that point. This is a concern about whether or not financial market participants are going to treat it as a commitment to following that path, and whether or not they're going to be confused about what exactly the forecast is and so on. The only thing I can say is that for the central banks that have moved to publishing the path, we haven't really observed that problem. So we haven't observed the problem in New Zealand. Financial markets adapted very, very quickly and understood, you know, what the path of the policy rate was. I think Thomas is probably going to say tomorrow that exactly the same thing happened in the Czech Republic. So we haven't really seen it, but there's a very important caveat that I want to stress, and that is the following. I'm sorry, I tried to explain this, but maybe it was lost a little bit. So when we look at this forecast, it's the forecast of the Monetary Policy Department. Governor Tuma at the Czech National Bank actually explained this to me, because once we were having this very same discussion about whether or not, you know, financial markets are actually going to take this seriously when it's the staff forecast and not the forecast of the policymakers. And the way he described it to me is this way. He said, this forecast is constructed by the Monetary Policy Department, but the Monetary Policy Department works inside the central bank, and I'm the governor of the central bank. So this whole idea that, I mean, if you're going to publish this thing, you're effectively putting your stamp on it. I think the language that's used at the Czech National Bank is, in every preface to the inflation report, is that this forecast is produced by the Monetary Policy Department. It is a very important input, but not the only input for monetary policy. Now, we've gone back and actually looked at how financial markets have responded to publication of this interest rate forecast. And it's behaving, you know, much like one would want it to behave, in the sense that it actually moves and influences longer term interest rates and so on in the direction that we probably want them to be moving in and so on. But there's a very, very important caveat. I would not recommend, for example, ever that the policymakers try to own this path. Okay? And the reason for not doing that is that it's just impossible for policymakers to sit around, decide about the policy rate, and think about generating a consistent forecast that's going to be consistent with that decision. There just isn't time to do it. So I think this is kind of the best balancing act between, you know, having some stamp by the central bank, obviously since they publish it, so they're obviously taking it, you know, seriously and so on, without actually saying that I'm owning a very specific path for the policy rate. So I don't know if that answered your question, but the experiences have been pretty good. Yeah. Alex, you could use this.
Okay. I want to bring in the counterexample. Okay. Not because I disagree with what you say, but because I think that one has to see the two sides. You know, the Czech National Bank, very nice, you know, and there is a procedure and all that. But here I want to bring out another interventionist in the foreign exchange market, the Swiss National Bank.
I'm sorry, can you put the mic closer? So
And, you know, the Swiss National Bank, as probably most of the audience knows, in 2011, actually they made an announcement that they are going to peg the Swiss franc to the euro indefinitely. You know, they didn't specify exactly when they are going to get off, and they actually stuck to it. And in every report that they wrote, they said we are taking that very seriously. And they repeated that many, many times. Every time they repeated that and all that. And then suddenly, out of the blue, when the European Central Bank decided to go negative on the interest rates, they, you know, completely out of it, they made a complete surprise, and they reneged on this commitment, in a sense, or something like that, surprised markets. And I know that many institutions and people all over the world actually were quite surprised, and some of them lost quite a bit of money because of that. So this is a counterexample of things that had actually happened. And, you know, and I'm not blaming the Swiss National Bank for not being, you know, for not being truthful or something like that, because, you know, because for them, with the move that was taken suddenly by Draghi at the European Central Bank was a surprise. And they had to take care of their own economy, small open economy, and they did what they could under the circumstances. So this is, I think one has to recognize that those kinds of things also may occur in reality.
I don't want to go too much into this, because I think Thomas is going to go through it in detail, why the Czech National Bank's FX intervention strategy was so successful. But I just want to tell you that the critical aspect was that it was done with a framework. So in other words, where you think about the exchange rate as an instrument and not as a target. So this was very important, because they said that they were prepared to change the exchange rate in the future, in other words, depreciate further if conditions warranted it. And that, in combination with buying unlimited foreign assets and having a framework to communicate monetary policy, meant that at least in the early stages, they actually didn't even need to do interventions, because it was just consistent with what I was trying to describe. People revised up the expected price level in the future. They knew that they planned to overshoot, and as a result, the whole policy framework was, you know, consistent. So you have to have consistency if you're going to do something like that. And if people are thinking that you're actually trying to target the exchange rate, you can obviously run into problems.
can we do a quick survey here? So which central banks actually publish interest rates in this room? So we have Czech National Bank, we have New Zealand, South Africa, just recently, I think 2 years, Norwegia, so we have Norway, we have Georgia, and
Ukraine since the previous quarter.
And Ukraine since the previous quarter. Okay. So 5 countries, 16, yeah. Okay.
There's actually a good story about, Shelba, could you tell the story about Georgia, about publishing the map of the policy rate?
Doug, at some point you have to stop stressing out Shalva in very unexpected ways. So Shalva is from the National Bank of Georgia.
Hi, so I'm from the National Bank of Georgia. We started publishing the interest rate projections in 2016, and back then long-term interest rates were quite high. We were in a tightening phase prior to that because inflation was above target, but then inflation started going down, and the long-term bonds didn't decline as much because people feared that the central bank may not reduce interest rates because politicians were worried about the exchange rate. So they worried that we might be stuck at the high level of the interest rates. Also, there was fear that we may limit the liquidity from the central bank, so that long-term interest rates were quite high. But then we started publishing the interest rate projection, by which we showed that in the medium term we were going to decline the interest rates, and also we emphasized our commitment to interest rate targeting framework, and these two things worked quite well for us because long-term interest rate declined by about 300 basis points, and this was pretty much consistent with our projection of the interest rate path, which we published. So we tried to explain to the market the conditional feature of this interest rate projection, and they digested it quite well. They understand that it was conditional, that we were forecasting interest rates to decline as long as inflation were to remain close to the target and started to decline from the high levels. And this, I think financial markets digested it quite well. They understood this feature of this forecast, and since then we haven't had any problem with this forecasting interest rate. And since then, inflation had been moving around target and being close to it, and we partly attribute this to this more active central bank communication with this interest rate strategy.
I think in a nutshell that when financial markets start building in a correlation that is inconsistent with what the central bank actually wants to do under a new monetary policy regime, publishing the path can actually be quite useful for telling the story to the market about what kind of considerations you're taking into account when you're thinking about this interest rate. And 300 basis points on long-term interest rates in Georgia, that's a nice result. Okay, yeah. So
and that's a reflection of lower interest rate premium, lower interest rate risk.
So just to go back, we really haven't seen in the cases where they have an analytical framework these bad consequences from publishing. Now, of course, you're right. I mean, if you didn't have a framework and you did publish, then you're always subject to the risk that something bad could be happened. So I agree with that entirely. But for the central banks that have established the framework, used the framework internally, it's simply just reducing, monetary policy uncertainty and improving how the transmission mechanism actually works. Sorry.
Okay. Are there any burning questions? Okay, yeah, okay, so it's good because we're ahead of a schedule. So we'll have 10 minutes break now so that we can split into rooms. You can see, you have the program here, so you can see there's session A and session B. So session A will continue here, and session B will be on the second floor. So we'll reconvene in 10 minutes, okay? So thank you very much, Doug.